Everyone, thank you for coming. I'd like to introduce Torsten Bittner, who will be presenting to us on analyzing IBM Watson experiments using the IPython Notebook. Torsten is from Seattle, Washington, and I guess with IBM. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, so as he said, I'm from the IBM Emerging Technologies team. I work out of Seattle, Washington. And over the last couple of days, you've seen many examples about how the IPython Notebook is used, lots of different applications. And right now, I'm going to tell you about how we at IBM used the IPython Notebook to perform analysis. So first of all, quick show of hands. Who of you is familiar with what IBM Watson is? Okay, so most of you. So just in general, it's a system that IBM developed. It consists of software and hardware. It's a system that played the game of Jeopardy. And Jeopardy is a question-answer game. You have a question, you get an answer. And about 2 years ago, IBM Watson won a challenge match on TV against the two former human all-time champions. So it was a great accomplishment. And so I'll quickly talk about what IBM Watson is in a nutshell. After Watson won the game, IBM has been hard at work in adapting Watson to new domains. And there are some challenges that we faced in there that I'm going to describe to you. And you might find that some of these challenges that we faced are very similar to challenges that you're facing on a daily basis. And if so, then the IPython Notebook might also be a good solution for you or a good approach to solve your problems. Because we did an our initial approach was using Java, Dojo, and D3, and that had some downsides to it, and that's why we ended up using the IPython Notebook. So when you're trying to use a system like IBM Watson, there are essentially 4 steps you have to do. So, and the first 3 steps are essentially what IBM did over like 4 years for the domain of Jeopardy. As you're setting up the system, you're getting it ready to answer a question. And then the 4th step is that you're running the system and you're trying to answer questions. Now, the first step is ingestion. So you have to identify data that's relevant to your domain. And in the case of Jeopardy, that was the Wikipedia, because Wikipedia, lots of broad-based knowledge, very ideal for answering trivia questions. Then you have to pre-process the data. So you're extracting relevant content from these data sources, and you are you're running some natural language processing to really extract the important nuggets from the data. You create search indices, like Watson is using under the cover the open source full-text search engine Lucene. And you're trying to identify candidate answers by using full-text search. You're also creating other relational and non-relational data stores that allow the system at runtime to quickly access relevant content. IBM uses, Watson uses supervised learning. So that means for step 2, you have to train the system. You have to create a set of question and answer pairs as a training set. In case of Jeopardy, that was pretty easy because online you can find an archive of all the questions that were ever asked on the Jeopardy show, including with their correct answers. It was a perfect training set. And so you run this training set through Watson in order to train the machine learning models. And so once you have the correct answer from the pair that you defined and Watson's answer, you try to match them, and you assign the weights for the features in the machine learning model in a way to get the most answers that Watson gives to be the correct answers. Then once you've created the machine learning models that way, you test the system by using a blind set, again, questions for which you know the answers, and you run them through the system, and then you measure now the accuracy of the Watson system. And you essentially go through the steps 1 to 3 many times. We call it an experiment. And then at the very end, when you're satisfied with the measured accuracy, then you go into production and you let Watson out to the world for your domain. Now, this is an overview of the Watson pipeline. And you can look at it on the left side, a question comes in. And on the right side, an answer with a certain confidence comes out. Now, in the middle, what happens, a couple of steps. So the first one is the question and topic analysis. One thing that Watson does, it tries to assign question classes to the individual, for a question. So if the question is, where is the SciPy conference, then you're looking for a location. If the question is, how many attendees does the conference have, you're looking for a number. Or when is the SciPy conference, then you're looking for a date. So you're trying to assign a class to the question. You then decompose the question further, and you create a query that you're then sending to your primary search. And primary search can be, for example, done in Lucene. So Lucene index is being crawled for the ingested content that was ingested in step number 1. And you're trying to identify potential candidate answers. Those candidate answers are then being filtered, and there's some scoring that goes on. During the scoring, we also gather supporting evidence, where we go again out to previously ingested content, and we're trying to identify more evidence that prove the correctness of a certain answer. Then you synthesize the answer. During the training, you then actually define the training models, and during runtime, you using the trained models to compute the final answer. So you do a final merging and ranking of all the candidate answers, and you return the answer to the user. Now, when we tried to adapt Watson to a new domain, there were several challenges. And simply said, the main problem is that Watson is complex, and it's a very large system. And there are lots of knobs in the system. And knobs are in form of data, algorithms, and models. So data, when you're looking at Wikipedia, then you have a lot of data that helps you answer broad-based knowledge questions. But when you're trying to answer rocket science questions or anything biochemistry, astrophysics, then your data might not be so good for that. And you have to find the right data that helps you for your domain. And choosing that data affects everything downstream in the system. For the algorithms, an example are NLP algorithms. So if you change the way that you're extracting named entities, for example, that will affect the system in many different ways. Similarly for models, if you're choosing different machine learning techniques, or if you're changing the features that you're choosing, then that also has a lot of side effects. Now, one important thing is the dependencies. They are there are lots of them in the entire system, and there are dependencies between the components and also between changes in these components. This graph shows the pipeline, again, from left to right, starting out with the question analysis on the left, and on the right, the final merging and ranking. And it shows that the number of information dependencies rises as you go through this pipeline. So if you make a change very on in the pipeline, that affects everything downstream, and that is something you have to keep track of. And an example is, for example, I mentioned Lucene is used for primary search. If you're introducing another search engine, let's say INDRI, which is another open source full text search engine, then you're adding it here about here to the search. And this will affect the candidate generation, because now certain candidate answers are being created from Lucene, others are coming from INDRI. So you have to account for that. Also in the scoring, you now have to figure out, okay, if a question was answered from Lucene, how does it compare to a question that was answered from INDRI? So you have to manipulate these components as well. So this is essentially showing a large number of dependencies and complexity in the system. You also have to identify the metrics that are relevant. In the end, the main metric is always going to be, did Watson answer the question correctly or not? But in order to get there are lots of intermediate metrics that you can apply. For example, you can look at, okay, what candidate generated my question. If maybe it turns out that Lucene is doing really well and I should try to take advantage of that knowledge. Or maybe INDRI is doing really badly, and then I know, okay, I should maybe look into that and fix that problem. So essentially what it comes down to is there are lots of experiments that you can run with lots of knobs that you can turn, and you have to decide which one is the most important one for you at a certain point in time, and it gives you the best bang for the buck. And documentation was a big issue for us, because we And we wanted to remember what we did. Whenever we changed something, and we wanted to remember what was the impact of that, and we wanted to attribute results back to experiments. So this were kind of our problems, and we set out a set of driving principles that we wanted to apply a scientific method for dealing with all these experiments. We figured out we had to perform a lot of ad hoc analysis, because one analysis was always different from the one before. And then we had to study the knobs, turn them one at a time, and do a very step-by-step approach. And we always focused on something measurable, and we then had to develop tooling to support this process. Now, the first tooling that we developed, one of the goals that we had was to create a graph like this here. So I mentioned the question classes before, that when Watson analyzes the question, it tries to put it into a certain bucket. It says, oh, this is a date question, that's a number question, or this is a definition question. And having that knowledge is important for many reasons. One is that you find out a lot about the question set that you have. So you see that maybe my question set is not completely representative yet for the types of questions that I'm expecting people to ask in a certain domain. And you could also find out things like, oh, maybe Watson is doing really, really well on number questions, but it's doing kind of poorly on date questions. So that gives you some information about what aspect of the system you have to tune. And now to create this graph, we wanted to put together a website that shows a graph. So what we did is then we wrote a simple container web app, about 150 lines of HTML, JavaScript, and Dojo code. Then we had to write code to extract the relevant experiment results. As Watson runs an experiment, so you go through the entire pipeline, what happens there is that along the way there are lots of metrics that are being, and values and lots of data that's being kept track of during this process. It's in the gigabytes for every experiment. And to extract those relevant experiment results for this graph, we had to write some code. And turned out we wrote like a MapReduce-based approach, and there was about 7,900 lines of Java code to extract the experiment results. Then we also wrote the D3 visualization code to draw the graph that you see up at the top, and that was about 300 lines of code. So in total, we had about 8,350 lines of code in 3 different languages. Now, we did the same analysis now with the IPython Notebook, because this approach didn't scale that well. So we used the IPython Notebook, and this is what it took to get the same analysis done with the IPython Notebook. So at the bottom, you can see a graph as well. I mean, you probably cannot read everything, but that's not the idea. I just wanted to show you. It's about 20 lines of Python code to get there. But I tricked a little bit. So at the top, there are a couple of imports. One of the imports is the result proc module. There's another about 200 lines of Python code that do the extraction of the relevant results, which is still a lot less than the 7,900 lines of code that we wrote in Java to do the same thing. And essentially what this notebook does, it has a couple of imports at the top. It loads the experiments. We're using the IPython, the parallel engine here to distribute some of the computation. We define a reducer function that we then apply to pandas data frame that we populate here. And in the end, we plot out the content of a pandas data frame. And so there was one main benefit here, that we only had 220 lines of code now in one language, and that was really nice. Our setup looked like this. So we installed the IPython Notebook in a Python virtual environment. So if you're not using the Python virtual environment yet, you have to do that. That's really cool, because you just can package everything. You can move it to different machines, install it on multiple machines, and have everything bundled nicely together. We installed a couple of packages that are listed here, and then deployed a notebook server for each team member in a cluster environment. One nice thing was that the cluster environment that was running the notebook server was the same that also hosted the experiment results. So we had a shared file system that was very nice for the performance for running our experiments. And we also deployed then worker nodes across 10 machines for parallel processing of the results. Here are a few more examples, and again, you probably can't read everything, just to give you a general idea of the type of graphs that we wanted to create and the type of analysis that we wanted to do. So if you look here on the right-hand side, we have like simple pie charts that compare one experiment in blue with another experiment in orange. Here, this one, for example, shows how many answers came from a certain candidate generator. And that can give you insight again into what candidate generator is doing really well for a certain set of questions, and it helps you to understand the system better. This fancy diagram here on the left is a chord diagram that shows a comparison between two experiments. On the outer ring, you have one experiment. On the inner ring, you have another experiment. And the lines here, they show how the rankings shift between those two experiments. So you can see that like certain number of answers that were ranked at position number 1, they migrate in the other experiment to position number 2 to 5, and vice versa. Like some were migrating to position 10 to 50, and so on. You just get a general understanding of the movement of the data, or the answers and the rankings. And here the table at the bottom is just another example of, we created this dojo grid for drilling into some more detailed content. And a table is usually a very good way to let people look at lots of details. And again, we had to put some effort into writing this dojo grid, but with pandas, we got it for free in the IPython Notebook. So bottom line is that there are a lot of pros to using the IPython Notebook for us. So for us, we were using less languages, less code, and we had all these many Python libraries available that made all this possible, that allowed us to write less code and use what other people had done before. We also enabled a broader population to carry out analysis, because not everyone in our field was familiar with Java and JavaScript, and you had to go back and forth between the different environments and languages. And with Python, you just stayed within one language. Then another great benefit was also that the code was the analysis. So everything that we did, we could document right within the notebook. So our hypothesis, our ideas, our thinking behind what could improve the performance of Watson, experiment descriptions, everything we could write down, and it was right next to the code that actually ran experiments. And it was easy to reproduce results, communicate, share it with team members. We got a lot of scalability benefits as well for the processing. In order to analyze our experiment results, we had now response times for about like 2 seconds for running our analysis for experiment results. And previously, for the MapReduce-based approach in Java, it was about 2 minutes. So that also speed up our development cycle. And another very nice feature of the notebook was the simple remote development, because we were writing all the code locally in our browser, and all the experiments, they were running on some other cluster. And all the data was out on that cluster, and with the Java-based approach, we had to write the code locally, then push it somehow to that cluster, run everything on the cluster, and then also get to the results somewhere. And with the notebook, everything we wrote locally, but it was all running on the cluster automatically. That's a very nice feature. We also found that the notebook was very flexible to use, not only for the experiment analysis that I just described here, but it was good for ingestion as well. So for the ingestion, there's a lot of hand coding that you often have to do. If you scrape certain pages, or you have to clean up some content, there are libraries like Beautiful Soup and other libraries that really help you to do all these things. And yeah, you could really take advantage of all the flexibility directly in the IPython Notebook. So in summary, Watson is a powerful and complex system, and the domain adaptation required changes to data, algorithms, and models. And we found the IPython Notebook to be a very great tool to do our ad hoc data manipulation, analysis, and visualization. It was great for documentation, and performance was great as well using parallel processing. So if your problems are somewhat similar to what I just described, then I suggest you to give the IPython Notebook a try. Thank you. Okay.
So one of the themes, given that one of the themes is machine learning, can you share any of the lessons learned from the experiment?
Okay. one of the, so whether I can share lessons learned from the machine learning. I think there are actually a couple of papers published that IBM Research published about machine learning, and I think that's pretty much the degree of what I can talk about here. So I can point you to those papers afterwards if you can come over. Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the other themes of the conference is reproducibility in science. There's a talk, keynote today, and I've talked about that. So kind of the first question is, there's a GitHub repo for Watson.
Okay, so there's.
And then second, it really is like, what is IBM's stance on kind of open science?
Yeah. Okay. So the question was about whether, in the spirit of reproducibility and sharing, whether some of this analysis is available on GitHub. Yeah, and it's not. And what IBM's general stand on this is. So in general, and I speak mostly for myself here, I think IBM is involved in many open source communities like Eclipse and lots of things that came out of IBM. And yeah, it just depends on, I guess, the business area whether we're contributing back to open source or not.
We're obviously thrilled to see that you guys are happy with IPython, but you didn't have a slide on the cons.
Yeah.
For us, that's one of the most important pieces of feedback is what were the pain points, what can we, or what do we need to fix?
Okay, so what are the cons? And yeah, one of the cons was actually what Brian mentioned yesterday. So the scrolling issues, they drove me nuts at times. And yeah, it worked, you know. And one other thing was the multi-user environment. Another one was interacting with the graphics so that you can click on something, manipulate it. And we were very happy to see that all of these things were actually on the roadmap already when we found those. So I mean, we were actually thrilled seeing the vibrant community around it and being here at the conference. I'm totally, that's confirmed with me that it's a great technology that is getting pushed forward and very useful. Yeah.
So would you allow the IPython project to post your slides on our website to sort of showcase how you've used IPython?
Yeah, I think that's okay. Whether I allow the slides to be posted, yes. Yeah.
Okay, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah.
You said by switching to in-memory parallel processing in Python versus Hadoop that uses disk space snapshotting of the intermediate state, you gained a lot of performance. But didn't you use the ability to do parallel joins on your data? Don't you need to do any kind of SQL-ish joins or stuff like this?
Okay. The question was whether we moved from the MapReduce-based approach to the processing everything in memory, and whether we lost some of the ability to perform joins there. Pretty much as we didn't need to use those. So I mean, certainly we lost some of the capabilities, but for what we tried to do, the processing in memory worked just as well. And we had the advantage that everything was loaded into memory, and that's obviously a lot faster.
Okay.
One more.
One more?
It sounds like, so there was also another talk about kind of hyperparameters. If you're trying to basically try a lot of different models and a lot of different methods, in many ways, can't you do machine learning on machine learning here?
Okay, whether we can do machine learning or machine learning here. I think we probably also want to take that offline. I don't know how to answer that one. Yeah, sorry.
Let's thank our speaker once again.
All right. Thank you.